The elevator doors slid open with a soft whisper, revealing the marble-clad lobby of Meridian Technologies on what I assumed would be just another ordinary Tuesday morning. The familiar scent of expensive coffee from the executive floor and the gentle hum of productivity filled the air as I stepped into the space I'd helped build from a struggling startup into a tech powerhouse worth over $200 million. I adjusted my navy blazer and checked my reflection in the polished steel elevator panel, the same ritual I'd performed every morning for the past 8 years as Chief Technology Officer. Nothing could have prepared me for the conversation that was about to unfold in Conference Room A, the glass-walled sanctuary where I'd presented countless innovations that had transformed our small software company into an industry leader. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've spent the better part of a decade turning lines of code into revolutionary software solutions that businesses across 3 continents now depend on. At 32, I'd already earned recognition as one of the youngest female CTOs in Silicon Valley, though most people didn't know the full extent of my involvement with Meridian Technologies. What they saw was a dedicated executive who arrived early, stayed late, and consistently delivered products that exceeded market expectations. What they didn't see was the substantial equity stake I'd accumulated through strategic investments, employee stock options, and a series of calculated financial moves that had positioned me as the company's largest individual shareholder. The morning started innocuously enough. I was reviewing the quarterly development metrics in my corner office, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay, when my assistant Marcus knocked on the glass door with an expression I'd never seen before. Marcus had been with me for 3 years, a Stanford MBA who managed my calendar with military precision, and had never once appeared flustered by anything from hostile takeover rumors to system-wide security breaches. "Sarah, there's something you need to know," he said, closing the door behind him with unusual care. Richard Morrison just arrived with someone he introduced as his nephew, Brad Morrison. They've been in closed meetings with the executive team for the past hour, and security just received instructions to prepare termination paperwork. I set down my coffee, immediately alert. Richard Morrison had founded Meridian Technologies 12 years ago with a revolutionary idea for enterprise resource planning software and enough venture capital to make it reality. He'd been my mentor, the person who'd recognized my potential when I was fresh out of MIT with a computer science PhD and more ambition than experience. Over the years, we'd built something extraordinary together, transforming his initial vision into a comprehensive technology platform that Fortune 500 companies paid millions to license. Termination paperwork for whom? I asked, though something in Marcus's expression already suggested the answer. "That's just it," he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. Security wouldn't specify, but Janet from HR mentioned they're preparing documentation for someone in senior leadership. The nephew apparently flew in from New York specifically for this meeting. I'd heard Richard mention Brad Morrison in passing, always with a mixture of family obligation and barely concealed frustration. The nephew, who'd graduated from Wharton with an MBA in finance, spent 2 years at a prestigious consulting firm, and harbored ambitions of revolutionizing the technology sector, despite having never written a line of code or managed a development team. According to Richard's occasional complaints during our private strategy sessions, Brad possessed the confidence that often accompanies inherited privilege, but lacked the practical experience that builds genuine competence. The intercom on my desk crackled to life with the voice of Richard's executive assistant, Sarah. "Mr. Morrison requests your presence in Conference Room A immediately for an urgent management discussion." Marcus and I exchanged glances. In 8 years of working closely with Richard, he'd never summoned me to meetings with such formal language. Our collaboration had always been characterized by casual communication, shared decision-making, and mutual respect for each other's expertise. This sudden shift to corporate formality triggered every instinct I'd developed during years of navigating Silicon Valley's complex political landscape. "Should I cancel your afternoon meetings?" Marcus asked, already reaching for his tablet. "Not yet," I replied, straightening my shoulders and mentally preparing for whatever awaited me in that conference room. But keep my calendar flexible just in case. The walk to conference room A felt longer than usual, past the open plan workstations, where my development teams were deep in code reviews and sprint planning sessions. These were the people who had helped me transform Richard's initial vision into reality. Engineers and designers who'd worked nights and weekends to meet impossible deadlines, colleagues who'd celebrated product launches and commiserated over technical setbacks. Many of them had joined Meridian specifically because of the innovative culture we'd cultivated, the collaborative environment where good ideas mattered more than hierarchy. Conference Room A occupied prime real estate on the executive floor, its transparent walls offering privacy through electronically controlled opacity, while maintaining the open aesthetic that defined our corporate culture. As I approached, I could see 3 figures seated around the polished conference table. Richard sat at the head, his usual position, but his posture seemed unusually rigid. Beside him sat a younger man I'd never seen before, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that screamed East Coast consulting culture. The third person was Janet Rodriguez, our head of human resources, who avoided eye contact as I entered the room. "Sarah, please have a seat," Richard began, his tone professional but lacking the warmth that typically characterized our interactions. "I'd like you to meet my nephew, Brad Morrison. Brad recently completed his MBA at Wharton and has significant experience in corporate restructuring and operational efficiency." Brad Morrison rose to shake my hand, his grip firm and his smile practiced in the way that suggested extensive training in executive presence. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with perfectly styled dark hair and the kind of confident demeanor that often masks inexperience. His eyes conducted a quick assessment as we shook hands, the calculating look of someone sizing up what he perceived as competition or obstacles. "Sarah Chen," I replied, matching his professional tone while mentally cataloging first impressions. "Chief Technology Officer. I'm responsible for all product development, engineering operations, and technical strategy." "Ah yes, the CTO," Brad said, settling back into his chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "I've been reviewing the organizational structure, and frankly, I'm surprised by some of the redundancies I've identified in senior management." The words hung in the air like a challenge. I took my seat across from him, maintaining neutral expression while my mind began processing implications. In my peripheral vision, I noticed Janet shuffling papers with nervous energy, the kind of fidgeting that accompanied difficult conversations she'd rather avoid. "Brad has agreed to join Meridian as Chief Operating Officer," Richard continued, his voice carrying a note of resignation that suggested this announcement wasn't entirely his preference. "He'll be overseeing operational efficiency initiatives and implementing strategic restructuring to position us for the next phase of growth." I nodded thoughtfully, though internally I was calculating the implications of this sudden organizational change. In 8 years of building Meridian together, Richard and I had never discussed bringing in external senior management, particularly not family members, with questionable qualifications for technology sector leadership. The timing felt especially peculiar given our recent success with the quantum encryption module that had attracted acquisition interest from 3 major tech conglomerates. "Welcome to the team," I said to Brad, injecting appropriate enthusiasm into my voice while studying his reaction.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"What's your background in enterprise software development?" Brad's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his polished facade. "I have extensive experience in operational optimization across multiple industry verticals. My MBA thesis focused on identifying inefficiencies in technology companies and implementing structural solutions to maximize shareholder value." The corporate speak was impressive in its emptiness, the kind of consultant language that said everything and nothing simultaneously. I'd encountered similar rhetoric during board presentations from advisors who understood spreadsheets but had never managed actual product development cycles or dealt with the practical complexities of scaling technology platforms. "That's fascinating," I replied, matching his corporate tone. "Which specific technology platforms have you worked with?" Our quantum encryption integration requires deep understanding of cryptographic algorithms and distributed systems architecture. I prefer to focus on strategic oversight rather than getting bogged down in technical minutiae. Brad responded smoothly, though I caught the slight defensive edge in his voice. Effective leadership means understanding business outcomes, not necessarily every implementation detail. The statement revealed everything I needed to know about Brad Morrison's qualifications for leading a technology company. He was a business school graduate who viewed engineering as an implementation detail rather than the foundation of our competitive advantage. In his mind, technology was a commodity that could be optimized through management consulting frameworks, rather than a craft requiring deep expertise and continuous innovation. Richard cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the apparent purpose of this meeting. Sarah, Brad has conducted a preliminary analysis of our organizational efficiency, and we've identified some areas for immediate improvement. I'm always interested in operational improvements, I replied carefully, noting how Richard seemed to be reciting prepared talking points rather than speaking from personal conviction. What specific areas did you identify? Brad leaned forward, assuming the confident posture of someone delivering what he clearly believed was strategic brilliance. Frankly, I think this company has been operating with outdated management structures that create unnecessary complexity and redundant decision-making processes. The CTO position, while traditional in technology companies, represents a significant operational inefficiency when you have a capable CEO who can oversee technical operations directly. The words landed like a physical blow, though I maintained my composed expression through years of practice navigating hostile board meetings and investor presentations. Brad Morrison, who had been in the building for approximately 4 hours and possessed no apparent understanding of software development, was essentially arguing that my position was redundant because Richard could manage technical operations himself. That's an interesting perspective, I said, my voice steady, despite the surge of indignation building beneath my professional demeanor. Can you walk me through how you envision managing our current development pipeline? We have 47 active projects across 6 product verticals, including the quantum encryption module that's scheduled for beta testing next month. Brad waved dismissively, the gesture of someone who considered such details beneath his strategic purview. Those are implementation concerns that can be handled by middle management. What this company needs is streamlined leadership focused on market positioning and operational efficiency, rather than getting distracted by technical complications. I glanced at Richard, searching his expression for any sign that he recognized the fundamental absurdity of Brad's position. Richard had built this company from nothing, precisely because he understood that technology leadership required deep technical expertise, combined with business acumen. The idea that he could personally oversee complex software development while managing strategic operations demonstrated Brad's complete misunderstanding of what made Meridian successful. Richard, I said, addressing my mentor directly, you've always emphasized that our competitive advantage comes from technical innovation combined with market insight. How do you see that continuing under this new structure? Richard's discomfort was visible as he shifted in his chair, clearly caught between family obligations and business judgment. Brad brings fresh perspective on operational efficiency. We think it's worth exploring how we can optimize our leadership structure to reduce redundancy and improve decision-making speed. The diplomatic language couldn't mask what was happening. Brad Morrison had somehow convinced his uncle that eliminating the CTO position would improve company performance, despite having no apparent qualifications to make such assessments. Whether through family pressure, strategic manipulation, or simple inexperience in managing family business dynamics, Richard was allowing his nephew to dismantle the leadership structure that had built Meridian into an industry success story. I see, I replied, maintaining professional composure while my mind raced through implications and potential responses. What timeline are you considering for this organizational transition? Brad's smile returned, confident and predatory. Actually, we've decided to implement these changes immediately. Effective today, the CTO position is being eliminated as part of our operational streamlining initiative. We'll be restructuring the development teams under direct CEO oversight with improved efficiency metrics. The casual announcement of my termination, delivered with the confident authority of someone who clearly believed he was demonstrating strategic leadership, crystallized everything about Brad Morrison's fundamental incompetence. He was the kind of MBA who understood organizational charts but not organizational culture, who could identify cost centers on spreadsheets but couldn't recognize the human capital that drove innovation. I understand, I said, rising from my chair with deliberate calm. Janet, I assume you have the necessary paperwork prepared? Janet nodded uncomfortably, sliding a folder across the table. Your severance package includes full compensation through the end of the quarter, continuation of benefits for 6 months, and standard non-compete provisions. Security will escort you to collect personal items from your office. I accepted the folder without reading its contents, my mind already shifting from shock to strategic calculation. Brad Morrison had just made the most expensive mistake in Meridian Technologies' corporate history, though he wouldn't understand the implications until much later. His confident smile suggested he believed he'd successfully eliminated a redundant senior executive and demonstrated decisive leadership to his uncle. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to Meridian's success, I said, shaking hands with each person around the table. When I reached Brad, his grip was firm and his expression satisfied, the look of someone who believed he'd successfully navigated his first strategic challenge as an executive. Nothing personal, he said with practiced magnanimity. Sometimes difficult decisions are necessary for organizational optimization. I'm sure you'll find opportunities better suited to your skill set in a more appropriate technical role. The condescending tone was the final confirmation of Brad Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of both my capabilities and my position within the company. He saw me as a technical specialist who could be easily replaced, rather than recognizing the strategic architect who had helped build the foundation of everything he was now attempting to control. As I left Conference Room A, walking past the development teams who would soon learn about this organizational restructuring, I began mentally cataloging the resources and relationships I would need to implement my response. Brad Morrison had initiated what he believed was a strategic corporate maneuver. What he had actually done was declare war on someone uniquely positioned to destroy everything he hoped to accomplish. The security escort to my office was a professional courtesy, rather than a hostile supervision, reflecting the respect I'd earned from colleagues who understood my contributions to the company. As I packed personal items from the corner office I'd occupied for 5 years, I mentally inventoried the strategic assets Brad Morrison didn't know existed. The stock certificates locked in my home safe, the voting proxies I'd accumulated through relationships with key shareholders, the board relationships I'd cultivated through years of successful product launches and strategic initiatives. Marcus appeared in my doorway, his expression reflecting the shock and disbelief rippling through the executive floor as news of my termination spread. Sarah, what happened? The whole development team is in chaos. Half the senior engineers are talking about updating their resumes. I continued packing methodically, placing family photos and technical awards into the cardboard box security had provided. Change of leadership philosophy, I replied calmly. Brad Morrison believes the company will be more efficient without a CTO. But that's insane, Marcus protested, lowering his voice as he glanced toward the hallway. You designed half the systems that make this place profitable. The quantum encryption project alone is worth $50 million in projected revenue. I'm sure Brad has everything under control, I said with deliberate irony, sealing the box and preparing to leave the office, where I'd spent countless hours building Meridian's technological foundation. He has an MBA in operational efficiency. As I walked through the lobby for what everyone assumed was the final time, I reflected on the supreme irony of Brad Morrison's strategic miscalculation. He'd identified what he perceived as an operational inefficiency and eliminated it with decisive action, demonstrating to his uncle and the organization his capacity for bold leadership. What he'd actually done was termination the largest individual shareholder in Meridian Technologies, someone who controlled enough voting power to fundamentally alter the company's strategic direction. The afternoon sunlight felt different as I stepped onto the San Francisco sidewalk, carrying my personal belongings and considering the implications of Brad Morrison's spectacular error in judgment. He believed he'd successfully optimized organizational structure by eliminating redundant senior management. He had no idea he'd just provided me with both the motivation and the justification to demonstrate exactly who controlled Meridian Technologies. That evening, I sat in my Pacific Heights apartment, surrounded by the stock certificates and legal documents that represented 8 years of strategic financial planning. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brad Morrison's business school confidence had blinded him to the basic due diligence that would have revealed the fundamental flaw in his termination strategy. He'd fired the CTO without bothering to research her shareholding position or understand her actual influence within the company. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues expressing shock, confusion, and in several cases, outright anger at my termination. Senior developers who'd followed me from previous companies were questioning their future at Meridian. Key clients who'd specifically requested my involvement in their implementations were demanding explanations. The quantum encryption team was reportedly in chaos, with the lead architect threatening to resign rather than report to someone with no understanding of cryptographic systems. I poured myself a glass of wine and began reviewing the corporate governance documents that would guide my response to Brad Morrison's strategic blunder. As majority shareholder, I possessed rights and powers that extended far beyond those of a terminated executive. The same documents that Richard had insisted I read carefully when I'd first accumulated significant equity would now serve as the foundation for demonstrating exactly how poorly Brad understood the company he was attempting to control. Tomorrow would bring the first phase of my response to Brad Morrison's miscalculation, beginning with a series of conversations that would help him understand the difference between theoretical business knowledge and practical corporate power. He demonstrated his strategic thinking by eliminating what he perceived as operational redundancy. Soon, he would discover the educational value of learning exactly who controlled the company he thought he could restructure with impunity. The next morning arrived with an unseasonably clear San Francisco sky, the kind of perfect weather that made the city's corporate landscape appear deceptively serene. I dressed carefully in a charcoal gray Armani suit, the same professional armor I'd worn to crucial board presentations and hostile takeover meetings, then made my way to the law offices of Hartwell, Davidson & Associates, the premier corporate law firm that had handled Meridian's legal affairs since its initial incorporation. Patricia Hartwell greeted me personally in her corner office overlooking the financial district, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her expression reflecting the calculated intelligence that had made her one of Silicon Valley's most formidable corporate attorneys. We'd worked together on multiple acquisition negotiations and securities filings, developing the kind of professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared success. "Sarah," she said, settling behind her mahogany desk with the case files I'd requested, "I have to admit I was surprised by your call yesterday evening. The termination seems remarkably poorly timed given your equity position." I opened my leather portfolio, revealing the stock certificates and ownership documents I'd brought for review. I don't think Brad Morrison conducted adequate due diligence before implementing his operational restructuring strategy. Patricia examined the documents with the methodical precision that characterized her approach to corporate law, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. After several minutes, she looked up with an expression that mixed professional admiration with barely concealed amusement. "Let me ensure I understand the situation correctly," she said, leaning back in her leather chair. "You were terminated yesterday by Richard Morrison's nephew, who recently joined the company as Chief Operating Officer?" "That's correct," I confirmed. Brad Morrison eliminated the CTO position as part of what he described as operational streamlining, to reduce redundancy and improve efficiency. Patricia consulted her notes, then looked up with the satisfied expression of someone who'd identified a critical strategic advantage. "And Brad Morrison made this decision despite the fact that you currently own 62% of Meridian Technologies' outstanding shares?" 62.4%, I corrected with deliberate precision. "Accumulated through initial employee stock options, strategic secondary market purchases, and private transactions with departing founders who needed liquidity for personal investments." The exact percentage mattered, because it represented not just majority control but supermajority power that allowed me to implement fundamental corporate changes without requiring approval from other shareholders. Patricia understood the implications immediately, her expression shifting to the predatory satisfaction that characterized lawyers who'd identified an opponent's critical vulnerability. "Has he called a board meeting to discuss the organizational restructuring?" she asked, already reaching for her phone to begin coordinating legal strategy. "Not yet," I replied. "According to my contacts, he's spending his first week implementing what he calls immediate efficiency improvements before presenting a comprehensive strategic plan to the board." Patricia's smile was sharp, with professional anticipation. How delightfully thorough of him. This gives us time to prepare a proper response that will help Mr. Morrison understand the practical implications of his strategic decisions. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed the corporate governance documents that would guide my response to Brad Morrison's spectacular miscalculation. The shareholding agreements that Richard had insisted on, including protective provisions for key equity holders. The voting trust arrangements that consolidated my control over multiple share classes. The board composition requirements that ensured major shareholders maintained proportional representation in corporate governance. Your position is remarkably strong, Patricia observed, reviewing the final legal analysis her associates had prepared. As majority shareholder, you possess the authority to call special board meetings, propose fundamental changes to corporate structure, and effectively control strategic direction regardless of management preferences. I nodded, though my satisfaction was tempered by genuine regret about the necessity of confronting Richard so directly. He'd been my mentor and partner in building Meridian, someone I'd respected both professionally and personally. Brad's manipulation had forced a conflict that would inevitably damage our relationship regardless of the ultimate outcome. What's our timeline for implementing shareholder action? I asked, reviewing the draft legal notices Patricia's team had prepared. We can file for a special board meeting within 48 hours, she replied, consulting her calendar. Corporate bylaws require 7 days' notice for non-emergency meetings, but given the recent termination of senior management, we can argue for accelerated scheduling based on operational urgency. The legal framework was clear and favorable, but I knew the real challenge would be managing the personal and professional relationships that would be affected by my response to Brad's strategic blunder. The development teams who depended on stable leadership, the clients who trusted Meridian's technical capabilities, the board members who would need to choose between supporting management decisions and acknowledging shareholder authority. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, who was apparently maintaining his position as executive assistant despite the organizational turbulence. Brad called all-hands meeting for Friday. Plans to present new strategic vision for operational excellence. Development teams are panicking. I showed the message to Patricia, who raised an eyebrow with the expression of someone who'd witnessed countless corporate power struggles and recognized the signs of strategic overreach. Mr. Morrison seems determined to accelerate his own education in corporate governance. Should we wait until after his presentation? I asked, considering the tactical advantages of allowing Brad to fully commit to his strategic vision before revealing the fundamental flaw in his approach. Patricia considered this carefully, weighing legal strategy against practical psychology. There's value in letting him establish his position publicly before demonstrating why it's untenable. Sometimes the most educational lessons come from allowing people to fully commit to their mistakes. We decided to proceed with filing for the special board meeting while allowing Brad to present his strategic vision to the company. This would create a clear public record of his intentions and capabilities, while positioning my response as a measured reaction to demonstrated incompetence rather than personal retaliation for my termination. That afternoon, I visited the San Francisco offices of Meridian's 3 largest institutional investors, pension funds and venture capital firms, that had supported the company's growth through multiple funding rounds. These weren't courtesy calls, but strategic conversations with sophisticated financial professionals who understood the relationship between management quality and investment returns. David Chen, no relation despite sharing my surname, managed the technology portfolio for CalPERS, the California state pension fund that held 12% of Meridian's shares. His corner office in the financial district reflected the austere competence that characterized institutional investment management, functional furniture, and multiple monitors displaying real-time market data. I was surprised to hear about your departure, he said without preamble, settling behind his desk with the directness that characterized pension fund managers. Particularly given your role in developing the intellectual property that drives Meridian's current valuation. I explained the circumstances of my termination carefully, focusing on the organizational rationale Brad had presented rather than expressing personal grievances about the decision-making process. David listened with the analytical attention of someone evaluating potential risks to a significant institutional investment. What's your assessment of the new COO's qualifications? He asked, consulting the notes his research team had prepared about Brad Morrison's background. "He has strong academic credentials and consulting experience," I replied diplomatically. "Whether that translates to effective leadership in technology development remains to be demonstrated." David's expression suggested he understood the implications of my careful language. Institutional investors had seen countless examples of promising business school graduates who struggled to translate theoretical knowledge into practical results, particularly in technology companies where operational complexity required deep domain expertise. "CalPERS will be watching the quarterly results closely," he said, the understated warning that pension fund managers use to communicate their expectations to corporate leadership. "We have fiduciary obligations to our beneficiaries that require us to evaluate management performance based on actual outcomes rather than projected efficiencies." Similar conversations with representatives from Sequoia Capital and Goldman Sachs Asset Management confirmed that Meridian's key institutional investors were aware of my termination and concerned about its potential impact on operational performance. None explicitly criticized Brad Morrison's appointment, but their carefully professional language indicated they would be monitoring developments closely and evaluating management decisions based on measurable results. By Thursday evening, I'd established the foundation for my response to Brad Morrison's strategic miscalculation. Legal documentation was prepared for the special board meeting. Institutional investors were aware of the management transition and its potential implications. Key employees were expressing concerns about operational stability and strategic direction. All that remained was allowing Brad Morrison to present his vision for Meridian's future, providing him with the opportunity to demonstrate his understanding of the company he'd been appointed to help lead. His all-hands presentation would serve as the public record of his strategic thinking and operational priorities, creating the context for evaluating whether his approach aligned with shareholder interests and corporate objectives. Friday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy that permeated technology companies during major announcements. I arrived at Meridian's offices as a visitor, checking in with building security and receiving a temporary badge despite having helped design the access control systems that protected the company's intellectual property. The symbolism wasn't lost on me that I now required permission to enter the building, where I'd spent 8 years creating the technological foundation that supported everything Brad Morrison was preparing to control. The main auditorium buzzed with conversations, as employees speculated about the strategic vision Brad would present. I took a seat in the back, observing colleagues who'd helped build Meridian's success as they awaited guidance from someone they'd never worked with before. The development teams appeared particularly apprehensive, clustered together and speaking in hushed tones about potential organizational changes and their implications for ongoing projects. Richard Morrison entered the auditorium with his nephew, both wearing dark business suits that projected executive authority. Richard's expression reflected the uncomfortable tension of someone caught between family obligations and professional judgment, while Brad radiated the confident energy of someone preparing to demonstrate his strategic capabilities to a new organization. "Good morning, everyone," Richard began, his voice carrying to the back of the auditorium through the professional sound system. "As you know, we're entering an exciting new phase in Meridian's evolution, one that will require us to optimize our operations and streamline our leadership structure to maintain our competitive position in a rapidly changing market." The corporate language was uncharacteristically formal for Richard, who typically addressed company meetings with the casual directness that had characterized Meridian's entrepreneurial culture. His prepared remarks suggested Brad had influenced not just organizational structure, but communication style, imposing the kind of polished corporate presentation that consulting firms favored over authentic leadership engagement. "I'm pleased to introduce my nephew, Brad Morrison, who has joined Meridian as Chief Operating Officer to spearhead our operational excellence initiatives." Brad brings extensive experience in organizational optimization and strategic restructuring from his work with premier consulting firms and Fortune 500 companies. Brad stepped to the podium with practiced confidence, his presentation materials already loaded on the auditorium's main display screen. The opening slide featured bullet points about operational excellence, strategic alignment, and organizational efficiency, the kind of consulting framework that looked impressive in PowerPoint, but often struggled to address the practical complexities of running actual businesses. "Thank you, Richard," Brad began, his voice projecting the authoritative tone taught in business school presentation courses. I'm excited to share with you my vision for Meridian's next phase of growth, one that will position us for sustained success in an increasingly competitive marketplace. For the next 45 minutes, Brad delivered a comprehensive presentation that demonstrated both his theoretical understanding of business strategy and his fundamental misunderstanding of what made Meridian successful. He discussed market positioning and competitive analysis with impressive fluency, while revealing almost no awareness of the technical innovations that differentiated the company from its competitors. One of our immediate priorities, he explained, advancing to a slide titled Leadership Optimization, is streamlining our senior management structure to eliminate redundancies and improve decision-making efficiency. Effective immediately, we've consolidated technical oversight under direct CEO supervision, allowing us to reduce management layers and accelerate product development cycles. The euphemistic description of my termination drew murmurs from the development teams, who understood that consolidated technical oversight meant eliminating the CTO position that had coordinated their efforts and represented their interests in strategic planning. Several senior engineers exchanged glances that suggested Brad's organizational optimization was already having the opposite of its intended effect on team morale and operational confidence. Brad continued with detailed analysis of market opportunities and competitive positioning, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that impressed board members who evaluated companies through financial metrics rather than operational realities. His presentation was professionally polished and strategically comprehensive, exactly the kind of performance that convinced business executives that MBA graduates possessed the analytical capabilities to optimize any organizational challenge. Our quantum encryption initiative represents a significant opportunity for market expansion, he stated, advancing to financial projections that clearly came from marketing estimates rather than technical feasibility analysis. By accelerating development timelines and optimizing resource allocation, we can capture first-mover advantage in the enterprise security marketplace and establish Meridian as the dominant platform provider. I noted several technical impossibilities in his timeline projections and resource assumptions, fundamental misunderstandings about cryptographic development that suggested he'd never actually consulted with the engineering teams responsible for implementing his strategic vision. The disconnect between his confident presentation and actual development constraints was exactly the kind of management failure that destroyed promising technology companies. Questions? Brad asked, finishing his presentation with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd successfully communicated strategic brilliance to his new organization. The first question came from Elena Rodriguez, our senior cryptography architect, who'd led the quantum encryption development from its inception. Can you walk us through how you plan to accelerate the quantum encryption timeline given the current constraints around key distribution infrastructure? Brad's momentary hesitation was barely perceptible before he recovered with consulting speak. Those implementation details will be addressed through improved project management methodologies and strategic vendor partnerships. The important thing is maintaining focus on deliverable outcomes rather than getting bogged down in technical complications. Elena's expression suggested she understood exactly how little Brad knew about the project he was planning to accelerate, though she remained professionally diplomatic in her response. Of course. I look forward to discussing the technical requirements in more detail. Additional questions from the development teams revealed the growing gap between Brad's strategic confidence and his practical understanding of Meridian's operations. He fielded inquiries about budget allocation, personnel planning, and technical roadmaps with impressive verbal dexterity, while providing virtually no substantive answers that addressed the actual concerns being raised. After the presentation, as employees filed out of the auditorium with expressions ranging from confused to concerned, I approached Elena and several other senior team members who'd gathered near the stage to discuss what they'd just witnessed. "What's your honest assessment?" I asked quietly, though I suspected I already knew their evaluation. "He has no idea what he's talking about," Elena replied bluntly, glancing around to ensure Brad wasn't within hearing range. The quantum encryption project isn't something you accelerate through better project management. It's fundamental research that requires specific expertise and careful validation at every stage. Marcus appeared beside me, his expression reflecting the administrative chaos that had apparently followed my termination. Half the senior staff is asking about backup plans for their current projects. The other half is updating LinkedIn profiles. This is going to be a disaster. I nodded sympathetically while internally calculating the timeline for implementing my response to Brad Morrison's strategic vision. His presentation had provided exactly the evidence I needed to demonstrate the fundamental incompatibility between his management approach and Meridian's operational requirements. The special board meeting I'd requested would give institutional investors and independent directors the opportunity to evaluate his performance against actual business outcomes, rather than theoretical strategic frameworks. Keep me informed about how things develop, I told Marcus, handing him my personal contact information. I suspect there will be significant organizational changes in the near future. That afternoon, Patricia Hartwell's office buzzed with activity as her legal team finalized documentation for the special board meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. The formal notice had been delivered to all directors and major shareholders, citing concerns about operational stability and strategic direction following recent management changes. The institutional investors have confirmed their attendance, Patricia reported, reviewing RSVPs from board members and major shareholders. CalPERS is sending David Chen personally, which suggests they're taking this seriously. I reviewed the agenda Patricia had prepared, a careful balance of shareholder concerns and corporate governance requirements that would allow me to present my position without appearing vindictive or personally motivated. The focus would remain on operational effectiveness and strategic competence, rather than relitigating the decision-making process that had led to my termination. What's our opening strategy? I asked, considering how to frame my concerns in terms of fiduciary responsibility rather than personal grievance. We start with performance metrics, Patricia replied, consulting her legal briefing materials. Actual development timelines versus projected delivery dates. Client satisfaction scores before and after the management transition. Employee retention data from the past week. The approach was methodical and data-driven, exactly the kind of evidence-based analysis that institutional investors expected when evaluating management performance. Brad Morrison's strategic vision would be evaluated against measurable outcomes rather than theoretical frameworks, allowing board members to assess his actual capabilities rather than his academic credentials. Saturday and Sunday passed in careful preparation, reviewing financial documents and operational metrics that would support my position at the board meeting. I also spent time reaching out to key employees and clients who could provide objective assessments of Meridian's recent performance and their confidence in current leadership direction. The responses confirmed what I'd expected. Employee morale had declined significantly following the announcement of organizational restructuring. Several major clients had expressed concerns about continuity of technical support for their implementations. The quantum encryption team was requesting clarification about project leadership and timeline expectations. Monday morning brought a call from Richard Morrison, the first direct communication we'd had since my termination the previous Tuesday. His voice carried the strained formality of someone attempting to maintain professional relationships despite fundamental disagreements about corporate direction. Sarah, I understand you've called a special board meeting to discuss recent organizational changes. That's correct, I replied, maintaining neutral tone while noting the careful language he was using. As a major shareholder, I have concerns about operational stability and strategic direction that I believe warrant board attention. I hope you understand that Brad's appointment represents a strategic evolution rather than a criticism of previous leadership, Richard continued, clearly attempting to frame the conversation in terms of business development rather than personal conflict. I'm sure the board will evaluate the strategic rationale based on actual performance metrics, I responded diplomatically. Richard's suggestion that we schedule a private conversation before the board meeting was politely declined. The time for diplomatic discussion had passed when Brad Morrison decided to eliminate my position without conducting basic due diligence about my role in the company's ownership structure. Tuesday morning would provide the appropriate forum for addressing the strategic concerns that had emerged following his appointment as Chief Operating Officer. Patricia Hartwell arrived at my Pacific Heights apartment Monday evening, with final preparations for the board meeting, her leather briefcase containing the documentation that would demonstrate exactly how poorly Brad Morrison understood the company he was attempting to restructure. We spread financial statements and corporate governance documents across my dining room table, creating a comprehensive picture of Meridian Technologies' actual ownership structure versus the assumptions Brad had apparently made when implementing his operational optimization strategy. The board composition is favorable for your position, Patricia observed, reviewing the list of directors and their likely voting patterns. 3 independent directors, 2 institutional investor representatives, Richard Morrison, and yourself as majority shareholder. Even if Richard supports his nephew's position, you have clear authority to implement changes based on shareholder interests. I studied the corporate bylaws that governed board procedures, noting the specific provisions that protected shareholder rights and required majority approval for fundamental organizational changes. Brad Morrison's decision to eliminate the CTO position without board consultation violated several governance requirements that gave me legal grounds for challenging his authority, regardless of his family relationship with the CEO. What's our timeline for implementing changes if the board supports our position? I asked, reviewing the draft resolutions Patricia had prepared for various contingencies. Immediate implementation is possible for executive appointments and organizational structure, she replied, consulting her notes about corporate governance procedures. More comprehensive changes like bylaws amendments would require 30 days' notice, but we can establish interim leadership arrangements that address immediate operational concerns. The legal framework was clear and advantageous, though I recognized that Tuesday's board meeting would involve more than just technical discussions about corporate governance. Richard Morrison was being forced to choose between family loyalty and business judgment, a position that would inevitably strain our professional relationship regardless of the meeting's outcome. Tuesday morning dawned with the kind of crisp clarity that San Francisco experienced during its finest weather, the city's corporate landscape appearing deceptively peaceful from my apartment windows overlooking the bay. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that projected authority without aggression, the professional armor that had served me well during hostile takeover negotiations and difficult client presentations. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in Meridian's executive conference room, the same space where I'd presented countless product development updates and strategic initiatives over the past 8 years. Arriving 15 minutes early, I found Patricia already arranging presentation materials while board members gathered in small clusters, their conversations reflecting the tension that accompanied unexpected corporate governance meetings. David Chen from CalPERS nodded professionally as I entered, his expression suggesting the institutional investors had coordinated their approach to evaluating the situation. Margaret Thornton from Sequoia Capital appeared similarly prepared, reviewing documents on her tablet with the methodical attention that characterized venture capital analysis of management performance. Richard Morrison entered with Brad, both wearing dark suits that projected executive confidence despite the underlying tension surrounding this emergency meeting. Brad's expression reflected puzzlement more than concern, suggesting he still didn't understand why major shareholders would want to discuss his strategic appointments with the board, rather than simply accepting management decisions. "Good morning, everyone," Richard began as the meeting was called to order. "I understand Sarah has requested this special session to discuss recent organizational changes and their implications for operational effectiveness." I stood to address the board, drawing on years of experience presenting complex technical concepts to business executives who needed to understand practical implications rather than theoretical frameworks. "Thank you, Richard. As Meridian's largest individual shareholder, I have significant concerns about recent management decisions and their potential impact on both operational performance and long-term strategic positioning." Patricia distributed copies of the comprehensive analysis we'd prepared, financial documents that clearly illustrated my shareholding position, and the governance rights that accompanied majority ownership. Several board members appeared surprised by the specific percentages, suggesting that not everyone had been aware of the extent of my equity accumulation over the years. "As you can see from the documentation," I continued, "I currently hold 62.4% of Meridian Technologies' outstanding shares, acquired through initial employee stock options, strategic secondary market purchases, and private transactions with early investors who required liquidity for personal portfolio management." The precise percentage landed with visible impact on board members who understood its implications for corporate control. Brad Morrison's expression shifted from confident puzzlement to something approaching concern, as he apparently began to recognize that my presence at this meeting represented more than former employee grievances about termination procedures. "The recent elimination of the Chief Technology Officer position," I explained, "was implemented without board consultation and appears to be based on fundamental misunderstandings about both the technical requirements of our business and the governance procedures that guide major organizational changes. Margaret Thornton from Sequoia Capital leaned forward with the sharp attention that characterized venture capital evaluation of management competence. Can you elaborate on the technical implications of this organizational restructuring? I activated the presentation display, revealing detailed analysis of Meridian's current development pipeline and the technical leadership requirements that supported our competitive position in enterprise software markets. Our quantum encryption project alone represents 18 months of development work by specialized cryptography teams who require coordination with advanced mathematics professors from Stanford and MIT. The idea that this can be managed through generalized project management methodologies reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what drives our market differentiation. Brad Morrison requested permission to respond, his voice carrying the confident tone that had apparently convinced Richard to support his appointment as COO. I appreciate Sarah's perspective on technical management, but I believe we need to focus on strategic outcomes rather than getting bogged down in implementation details. Modern management theory emphasizes results-oriented leadership over micromanagement of specialized functions. The response perfectly illustrated his fundamental incompetence, though I allowed him to continue explaining his strategic philosophy without interruption. Sometimes the most educational lessons came from allowing people to fully demonstrate their misunderstanding of complex situations. The CTO position, while traditional in technology companies, creates unnecessary hierarchy and slows decision-making processes. Brad continued, clearly believing he was articulating strategic insight rather than revealing his ignorance. By consolidating technical oversight under CEO supervision, we eliminate communication barriers and accelerate product development timelines. David Chen from CalPERS exchanged glances with Margaret Thornton, their expressions reflecting the institutional investor skepticism that accompanied business school graduates who believed management theory could substitute for domain expertise. These were sophisticated financial professionals who had witnessed countless examples of promising strategic frameworks that collapsed when confronted with operational realities. Mr. Morrison, David said carefully, can you walk us through your specific experience managing software development teams or cryptographic research projects? Brad's momentary hesitation was telling before he recovered with consulting rhetoric. My background focuses on organizational optimization and strategic analysis rather than hands-on technical management. However, effective leadership principles are applicable across industry verticals when you understand how to align resources with strategic objectives. The answer confirmed everything the institutional investors needed to know about Brad Morrison's qualifications for leading a technology company. He possessed no relevant operational experience, but believed his business school training provided sufficient foundation for managing complex technical development processes. I see, Margaret responded diplomatically, though her tone suggested she understood exactly how inadequate Brad's background was for the responsibilities he'd assumed. What specific metrics are you using to evaluate the success of this organizational restructuring? Patricia handed me additional documentation while Brad attempted to explain his performance measurement framework, corporate efficiency indicators that demonstrated his complete disconnection from the practical realities of software development. As he spoke, I distributed detailed analysis of employee retention data, client satisfaction scores, and project timeline assessments that had emerged since his appointment. The operational impact has been immediate and measurable, I explained, highlighting specific data points that illustrated declining performance across multiple indicators. Senior engineer resignation letters have increased by 300%. The quantum encryption team has formally requested clarification about project leadership. 2 major clients have expressed concerns about technical support continuity for their implementations. The evidence was comprehensive and damaging, objective performance metrics that demonstrated the immediate negative consequences of Brad Morrison's strategic decision-making. Board members reviewed the documentation with the careful attention that accompanied their fiduciary responsibilities to institutional investors and pension fund beneficiaries. Richard Morrison requested an opportunity to address the concerns I'd raised, his voice reflecting the uncomfortable position of someone defending family appointments against objective performance evidence. Brad's transition into the COO role has admittedly created some temporary adjustment challenges, but I believe the long-term strategic benefits of organizational streamlining will justify short-term operational disruptions. Richard, I replied respectfully but firmly, Institutional investors entrust us with their capital based on demonstrated competence in managing complex technology development processes. Temporary adjustment challenges that compromise our competitive position represent fiduciary failures rather than acceptable transition costs. The language was deliberately professional but clearly confrontational, positioning the discussion in terms of board responsibility rather than personal conflict. Patricia had coached me to frame every concern in terms of shareholder interests and corporate governance requirements, making it difficult for Richard to dismiss my position as former employee grievances. Furthermore, I continued, the elimination of senior technical leadership without board consultation violates several corporate governance provisions that require majority approval for fundamental organizational changes. As majority shareholder, I'm requesting immediate reversal of these changes and implementation of proper oversight procedures for future management decisions. The legal ground was solid, and the business case was compelling, but I recognized that Richard was facing an impossible choice between supporting his nephew's strategic vision and acknowledging the evidence that Brad was fundamentally unqualified for technology sector leadership. Family relationships complicated business decisions in ways that institutional investors preferred to avoid. Brad Morrison requested another opportunity to defend his position, apparently believing he could overcome objective performance data through more sophisticated articulation of his strategic framework. I understand there's been some resistance to organizational optimization, but change management always involves initial adjustment periods before efficiency improvements become evident. The key is maintaining strategic focus rather than allowing short-term operational concerns to derail long-term competitive positioning. The consulting jargon was impressive in its complete disconnection from actual business realities, the kind of theoretical framework that sounded strategic in business school case studies but collapsed when applied to complex operational environments. Board members appeared increasingly skeptical as Brad continued explaining why measurable performance declines should be ignored in favor of projected future efficiencies. Margaret Thornton interrupted his explanation with the direct questioning that characterized venture capital evaluation of management competence. Mr. Morrison, what specific technology companies have you successfully restructured using these organizational optimization principles? The question was perfectly crafted to expose the fundamental weakness in Brad's position, requesting concrete examples of successful implementation rather than theoretical justification for strategic approaches. Brad's response revealed exactly what I'd expected about his actual qualifications for technology sector leadership. My experience focuses on cross-industry applications of organizational optimization principles rather than sector-specific implementations, he replied, apparently believing this answer demonstrated strategic sophistication rather than admitting he had no relevant experience. Effective management frameworks transcend industry boundaries when you understand how to analyze organizational efficiency metrics. David Chen leaned back in his chair with the expression that pension fund managers reserved for business school graduates who believed academic theory could substitute for practical experience. That's an interesting perspective, but CalPERS has fiduciary obligations that require us to evaluate management decisions based on demonstrated competence rather than theoretical frameworks. The institutional investor criticism was politely devastating, positioning Brad's appointment as a potential threat to pension fund returns rather than a strategic improvement to corporate leadership. Richard Morrison's expression reflected the growing recognition that his nephew's confident presentation was actually highlighting his fundamental inadequacy for the responsibilities he'd assumed. I think we need to consider the broader implications, Richard said carefully, attempting to find middle ground between family loyalty and business judgment. Perhaps we could explore modified organizational structures that address the concerns that have been raised while maintaining operational flexibility. The diplomatic suggestion revealed his growing awareness that Brad's position was becoming untenable, though he was clearly hoping to find face-saving compromises rather than acknowledging the complete failure of his nephew's strategic vision. Unfortunately for Richard, the institutional investors appeared to have already reached their conclusions about Brad Morrison's qualifications. Mr. Morrison, Margaret said, addressing Richard directly, Sequoia Capital has significant confidence in Meridian's technical capabilities and market positioning. However, our continued investment depends on management competence that supports rather than undermines the operational excellence that created our interest in this company. The venture capital warning was diplomatically phrased but strategically clear, positioning continued funding and support around management decisions that protected rather than endangered their portfolio companies' competitive advantages. Board members understood that losing institutional investor confidence would have immediate implications for corporate valuation and strategic options. Patricia nodded to me, indicating that the legal and business case had been sufficiently established to proceed with formal resolutions that would address the governance violations and operational concerns I'd identified. I'd like to propose several immediate measures to restore operational stability and ensure proper oversight of future management decisions. I distributed copies of the formal resolutions Patricia had prepared, comprehensive proposals that would reverse Brad Morrison's organizational changes while establishing governance procedures to prevent similar problems in the future. The documents reflected careful legal analysis designed to protect both shareholder interests and corporate operational requirements. First, I explained, immediate restoration of the Chief Technology Officer position with full authority over technical development, engineering operations, and strategic technology planning. Second, establishment of board oversight requirements for any senior management appointments or organizational restructuring. Third, implementation of performance evaluation procedures that assess management decisions based on measurable operational outcomes rather than theoretical strategic frameworks. The resolutions were comprehensive and specific, addressing both immediate concerns about Brad Morrison's impact and systemic issues that had allowed unqualified family appointments to compromise corporate governance. Board members reviewed the proposals with the careful attention that accompanied their fiduciary responsibilities to institutional investors. Brad Morrison attempted one final defense of his position, apparently believing he could still convince the board that operational performance metrics should be subordinated to strategic vision. I think we're losing sight of the long-term competitive positioning that requires organizational agility and management efficiency. These proposed changes would restore the same hierarchical structures that limit our ability to respond rapidly to market opportunities. The argument revealed his complete misunderstanding of what made technology companies successful, the bizarre belief that eliminating technical expertise would improve rather than compromise competitive positioning in markets defined by innovation and operational excellence. His confidence remained impressive, even as objective evidence accumulated against every aspect of his strategic thinking. Margaret Thornton requested a brief recess to allow institutional investors to coordinate their position on the proposed resolutions, a standard procedure that gave major shareholders opportunity to ensure unified response to significant governance decisions. Board members stepped outside the conference room while Patricia and I reviewed final details of the legal documentation that would formalize whatever decisions emerged from their deliberations. How do you assess our position? I asked Patricia quietly as we waited for the meeting to resume. Excellent, she replied without hesitation. The institutional investors clearly recognize that Brad Morrison represents a threat to their investment returns, and Richard understands that defending him against objective evidence would compromise his own position with the board. When the meeting reconvened, David Chen spoke for the institutional investors with the directness that characterized pension fund evaluation of management performance. CalPERS supports all three proposed resolutions. Our fiduciary obligations require us to prioritize demonstrated competence over family relationships when evaluating corporate leadership decisions. Margaret Thornton confirmed Sequoia Capital's agreement, effectively ending any possibility that Richard could maintain support for his nephew's position against unified institutional investor opposition. The independent directors quickly added their approval, creating overwhelming board consensus for reversing Brad Morrison's organizational changes. The resolutions are approved, Richard announced with obvious reluctance, his voice reflecting the personal cost of acknowledging his nephew's fundamental inadequacy for technology sector leadership. Brad, I think we need to discuss your future role in the organization privately after this meeting concludes. Brad Morrison's expression reflected genuine shock as he apparently realized for the first time that his confident strategic presentation had actually demonstrated his complete incompetence to sophisticated business professionals who evaluated management decisions based on results rather than rhetoric. The board meeting that was supposed to confirm his executive authority had instead exposed his fundamental unsuitability for the responsibilities he'd assumed. As board members gathered their materials and prepared to leave, I approached Richard with the mixture of professional respect and personal regret that characterized our relationship following this necessary confrontation. Richard, I hope you understand that this wasn't personal retaliation for my termination. The company we built together deserves leadership that protects, rather than endangers, its competitive position. His expression reflected the complex emotions of someone forced to choose between family loyalty and business judgment. The painful recognition that his nephew's appointment had been a strategic error that could have compromised everything we'd accomplished together. I understand your position, Sarah. I just wish there had been a way to handle this situation that didn't require such direct confrontation. The regret was genuine on both sides, though I recognized that Brad Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of corporate governance had made diplomatic resolution impossible. He'd eliminated my position without board consultation, violated several governance procedures, and demonstrated consistent disregard for the technical expertise that drove Meridian's success. Confrontation had become necessary to protect both shareholder interests and operational stability. Margaret Thornton approached as I was leaving the conference room, her expression reflecting venture capital satisfaction with crisis resolution that protected portfolio company value. Sarah, I assume you'll be resuming the CTO position immediately? That's my intention, I confirmed, though I want to ensure the transition addresses the operational disruptions that have emerged over the past week. Sequoia looks forward to continued partnership with leadership that understands what makes this company successful, she replied diplomatically, the venture capital equivalent of expressing relief that qualified management had been restored before serious damage could occur to their investment. Patricia gathered our presentation materials with the satisfied efficiency that characterized successful corporate governance interventions, legal victories that protected shareholder rights while addressing systemic weaknesses in oversight procedures. That was textbook corporate crisis management, she observed, as we prepared to leave Meridian's offices. Clear legal grounds, compelling business case, unified institutional investor support. The legal framework had indeed functioned exactly as intended, protecting shareholder interests against management decisions that threatened corporate performance and competitive positioning. Brad Morrison's appointment had violated both governance procedures and operational requirements, creating clear grounds for board intervention regardless of family relationships or strategic justifications. As I walked through Meridian's lobby for what everyone now understood would not be my final departure, I reflected on the educational value of Brad Morrison's spectacular miscalculation. He'd attempted to demonstrate strategic leadership by eliminating what he perceived as operational redundancy, inadvertently providing a comprehensive case study in why business school theory required domain expertise and practical experience to produce effective management decisions. The afternoon brought a series of conversations with senior employees who had witnessed the board meeting's outcome and were eager to understand the implications for operational stability and strategic direction. Elena Rodriguez appeared in my temporary office within an hour of the meeting's conclusion, her expression reflecting relief mixed with curiosity about how the situation had been resolved so decisively. I have to ask, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, how exactly did you manage to reverse a CEO's strategic decision through a single board meeting? I explained the shareholding position that had given me authority to challenge management decisions and request board review of organizational changes, corporate governance rights that Brad Morrison had apparently never bothered to research before implementing his efficiency optimization strategy. Elena's expression shifted from curiosity to amazement as she understood the implications of his oversight. He fired the majority shareholder without realizing who he was terminating, she asked incredulously. Apparently, he viewed me as a technical specialist who could be easily replaced rather than recognizing the strategic architect who helped build the foundation of everything he was attempting to control, I replied, summarizing Brad's fundamental misunderstanding of both my role and my position within the company. The conversation confirmed what I'd suspected about employee reactions to the recent organizational turbulence, widespread concern about operational stability and strategic direction that had created exactly the kind of performance problems I documented for the board. Elena's relief was representative of the senior technical staff who had questioned their future at Meridian under leadership that demonstrated no understanding of what made the company successful. Marcus appeared shortly afterward with updates on the immediate practical implications of the board meeting's outcome, administrative details that would restore operational stability while addressing the disruptions Brad Morrison's appointment had created. Half the resignation letters have been withdrawn, he reported with obvious satisfaction. The other half are requesting meetings to discuss their concerns about future organizational changes. The employee response confirmed the effectiveness of restoring qualified technical leadership, though I recognize that rebuilding confidence would require consistent demonstration of competence, rather than simply reversing problematic decisions. Brad Morrison's week of authority had damaged morale and created uncertainty that would take time to fully address. "What's the status of the quantum encryption project?" I asked, knowing that client commitments and development timelines had been compromised by the leadership uncertainty. "The team is requesting immediate clarification about technical direction and resource allocation," Marcus replied, consulting his notes about the various operational issues that had emerged during the management transition. "They've been in holding pattern since Brad's presentation suggested accelerating timelines without understanding implementation requirements." The project management crisis was exactly what I'd predicted when Brad Morrison announced his strategic vision for optimizing development processes through improved efficiency metrics, theoretical frameworks that ignored the practical realities of advanced cryptographic research. Restoring technical leadership would be meaningless without addressing the specific operational problems his mismanagement had created. The remainder of the afternoon was spent in meetings with development teams, client service representatives, and operational managers who needed clarification about strategic direction and resource priorities following the week's organizational upheaval. Each conversation confirmed that Brad Morrison's impact had extended far beyond my termination to create systemic uncertainty about Meridian's technical capabilities and management competence. By evening, I had established the foundation for restoring operational stability while implementing the governance procedures that would prevent similar management failures in the future. The board resolutions provided clear authority for technical leadership decisions, while the performance evaluation requirements would ensure that future strategic changes were based on measurable outcomes rather than theoretical frameworks. Richard Morrison requested a private dinner meeting to discuss the transition process and address the personal implications of the confrontation that had ended his nephew's brief executive career. We met at a quiet restaurant in the financial district, neutral territory that allowed for honest conversation about the relationship damage that inevitably accompanied such direct challenges to family-influenced business decisions. "I owe you an apology," he began as we settled into a corner table away from other diners. "I allowed family obligations to compromise my business judgment, and I didn't conduct adequate due diligence about Brad's qualifications for technology sector leadership." The admission reflected genuine regret, though I recognized that his position had been genuinely difficult. Brad Morrison had apparently presented himself as a qualified business executive whose consulting experience and MBA credentials provided sufficient foundation for optimizing technology company operations. Richard's mistake had been trusting family representations rather than conducting independent evaluation of his nephew's actual capabilities. "I understand the pressure," I replied diplomatically. "Family business dynamics create complications that pure corporate environments avoid. The important thing is that we've addressed the operational problems before they could compromise our competitive position." We discussed the practical implications of restoring the CTO position and implementing improved governance procedures, technical leadership responsibilities that would rebuild client confidence while ensuring proper oversight of future management decisions. Richard expressed genuine appreciation for my willingness to resume the role, despite the personal cost of confronting his family appointment so directly. "What happens to Brad?" I asked, recognizing that Richard would need to address his nephew's future while minimizing further damage to family relationships. "He'll be returning to New York," Richard replied with obvious relief. "I've helped him secure a position with a management consulting firm, where his analytical skills will be better suited to the client advisory role, rather than operational leadership." The solution was diplomatic and practical, removing Brad from a position where his fundamental misunderstanding of technology development could cause additional damage while providing him with opportunities better aligned to his actual qualifications. Consulting firms valued business school credentials and strategic analysis capabilities without requiring the domain expertise that made corporate leadership effective. As dinner concluded, Richard and I had restored the professional relationship that 8 years of successful collaboration had built, though both of us understood that his nephew's appointment had created trust issues that would require time and consistent performance to fully address. The crisis had been resolved, but the experience had illustrated vulnerabilities in our governance procedures that needed ongoing attention. Thursday morning brought the first of several meetings with major clients who had expressed concerns about technical support continuity during the management transition, corporate executives who needed reassurance that Meridian's operational capabilities remained stable despite the organizational upheaval. These conversations were crucial for maintaining business relationships that supported current revenue while preserving opportunities for future growth. Patricia Hartwell called that afternoon with updates on the legal documentation that would formalize the governance improvements approved by the board, corporate bylaws amendments that would prevent future management appointments without proper oversight and performance evaluation. The institutional investors are particularly satisfied with the governance reforms, she reported. This kind of proactive attention to shareholder protection enhances corporate valuation and investment attractiveness. The legal framework was comprehensive and forward-looking, addressing both immediate concerns about management competence and systemic issues that could compromise future corporate governance. Board oversight requirements would ensure that strategic decisions were based on objective analysis rather than family relationships or theoretical frameworks that lacked practical foundation. By Friday afternoon, operational stability had been largely restored, though rebuilding the innovation culture that had made Meridian successful would require sustained attention to employee morale and client confidence. The week had provided an expensive education in why corporate governance procedures existed, and why qualified leadership was essential for protecting both operational performance and shareholder value. Elena Rodriguez appeared in my office as I was reviewing the quantum encryption project timeline that had been disrupted by Brad Morrison's strategic optimization initiatives. "I have to say," she observed with obvious amusement, "this was the most educational week I've experienced in corporate crisis management. Business school case studies usually don't include the part where the MBA gets fired by the person he terminated." The irony wasn't lost on me that Brad Morrison's confident demonstration of strategic thinking had actually created a perfect case study in why theoretical management frameworks required practical experience and domain expertise to produce effective results. His appointment had been brief but comprehensive in illustrating exactly why venture capital firms and institutional investors evaluated management teams based on demonstrated competence rather than academic credentials. "At least the quantum encryption project can proceed with proper technical oversight," I replied, noting the implementation requirements that Brad had completely misunderstood in his timeline acceleration proposals. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from witnessing spectacular failures of strategic overconfidence. The weekend provided opportunity to reflect on the week's events and their broader implications for corporate governance and management evaluation. Brad Morrison's appointment had created a natural experiment in what happened when business school theory confronted operational reality without the practical experience necessary to bridge the gap between strategic frameworks and technical implementation. His failure had been comprehensive but educational, demonstrating why successful technology companies required leadership that understood both business strategy and operational complexity. The board's response had been swift and decisive, protecting shareholder interests while implementing governance reforms that would prevent similar problems in the future. Monday morning brought renewed focus on the technical innovations and market opportunities that had made Meridian successful, strategic initiatives that required the kind of domain expertise and practical experience that Brad Morrison had dismissed as implementation details. The quantum encryption project resumed with proper technical oversight. Client relationships were restored through competent communication about implementation capabilities, and employee morale recovered as qualified leadership addressed their operational concerns. The crisis had been resolved through corporate governance procedures that protected shareholder rights, while ensuring management accountability, legal frameworks that had functioned exactly as intended when confronted with strategic incompetence that threatened both operational performance and competitive positioning. Brad Morrison's education in corporate power dynamics had been brief but thorough, providing him with practical insights about business leadership that business school case studies typically omitted. The following months established a new equilibrium at Meridian Technologies, one built on strengthened governance procedures and renewed focus on the technical excellence that had originally distinguished the company in competitive enterprise software markets. The quantum encryption project achieved its beta testing milestones ahead of schedule, validating the development methodologies that Brad Morrison had dismissed as inefficient technical complications requiring optimization through improved project management frameworks. Elena Rodriguez presented the encryption module's performance metrics to an assembled group of Fortune 500 security executives, demonstrating cryptographic capabilities that exceeded theoretical projections and established Meridian as the definitive leader in enterprise quantum security solutions. The presentation took place in our renovated demonstration facility, a state-of-the-art showcase that illustrated the practical applications of advanced mathematical concepts in commercial technology environments. The key distribution infrastructure maintains quantum coherence across continental distances, Elena explained to the executive audience, her presentation combining theoretical cryptography with practical implementation details that demonstrated both technical sophistication and commercial viability. This represents a fundamental advancement in enterprise security architecture that eliminates traditional vulnerabilities while maintaining operational efficiency. The client response was immediately positive, with preliminary discussions about licensing agreements that could generate over $100 million in revenue during the next fiscal year. These conversations validated the strategic approach that prioritized technical innovation over operational optimization, confirming that competitive advantage in technology markets required domain expertise rather than generalized management efficiency. Richard Morrison observed the presentation from the back of the demonstration facility, his expression reflecting satisfaction with the technical achievements that had emerged under restored, qualified leadership. Our professional relationship had recovered from the strain of confronting his nephew's appointment, though both of us understood that governance vigilance would remain essential for preventing similar strategic miscalculations in the future. The board meeting was the right decision, he admitted during our private conversation, after the client presentation concluded. I allowed family considerations to compromise business judgment in ways that could have seriously damaged everything we've built together. The acknowledgement was professionally significant and personally meaningful, confirming that the corporate governance confrontation had ultimately strengthened, rather than weakened, our strategic partnership. Richard's willingness to acknowledge his error in judgment demonstrated the intellectual honesty that had made our collaboration successful over the years. Margaret Thornton from Sequoia Capital scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss the investment implications of Meridian's technical achievements and improved governance procedures. Venture capital analysis that evaluated both current performance and future growth potential. Her San Francisco offices overlooked the bay with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed our conversation in the context of Silicon Valley's broader innovation ecosystem. The quantum encryption capabilities position Meridian for significant market expansion, she observed, reviewing financial projections that incorporated the licensing revenue potential Elena had demonstrated to enterprise clients. More importantly, the governance reforms addressed the management competence issues that concerned institutional investors during the recent organizational disruption. The venture capital perspective emphasized both technical achievement and operational stability, dual requirements for sustained success in competitive technology markets where innovation capabilities and management excellence determined long-term competitive positioning. Margaret's continued investment commitment reflected confidence that qualified leadership would protect, rather than compromise the company's strategic advantages. What's your assessment of the broader market opportunity? She asked, consulting market analysis that positioned quantum encryption within the rapidly expanding enterprise security sector. We're looking at first-mover advantage in a market segment that could reach $20 billion within 5 years, I replied, referencing industry research that documented growing corporate demand for advanced cryptographic solutions. The technical barriers to entry are substantial enough to maintain competitive positioning for the medium term, assuming we continue prioritizing innovation over operational efficiency optimization. The strategic conversation reflected mutual understanding that sustainable competitive advantage required ongoing technical excellence rather than cost reduction initiatives that could compromise innovation capabilities. Margaret's investment philosophy aligned with operational approaches that prioritized capability development over short-term efficiency metrics. David Chen from CalPERS requested a separate meeting to discuss pension fund investment strategy in light of Meridian's improved governance procedures and technical achievements. Institutional investor analysis that evaluated corporate performance through the lens of fiduciary responsibility to fund beneficiaries. His downtown offices reflected the austere functionality that characterized public sector financial management. The board's response to management competence concerns demonstrates exactly the kind of governance vigilance that institutional investors require, he explained, reviewing documentation that analyzed corporate oversight procedures across CalPERS's technology portfolio. Fiduciary responsibility demands that we support companies with leadership accountability, rather than family appointment practices that compromise operational effectiveness. The pension fund perspective emphasized governance reform as much as technical achievement, recognizing that sustained performance required management systems that ensured qualified leadership regardless of personal relationships or family considerations. David's continued investment reflected confidence that improved oversight procedures would prevent future strategic miscalculations. The conversation also addressed broader implications for corporate governance in family-influenced companies, systemic issues that affected institutional investor confidence across multiple portfolio holdings. Your case study will influence our evaluation criteria for other investments, David noted, referencing governance analysis that would be applied to future investment decisions involving family business dynamics. By year's end, Meridian Technologies had not only recovered from the operational disruption caused by Brad Morrison's brief tenure, but had achieved record performance across multiple metrics that demonstrated the value of qualified technical leadership. Employee retention reached historical highs, client satisfaction scores exceeded industry benchmarks, and the quantum encryption licensing agreements generated revenue that surpassed initial projections by 30%. The annual board meeting provided opportunity to formally review the governance reforms that had emerged from the crisis, comprehensive procedures that ensured management accountability while protecting shareholder interests. Patricia Hartwell presented the legal framework that had been implemented, corporate bylaws that required board approval for senior management appointments, and established performance evaluation criteria based on measurable outcomes rather than theoretical strategic frameworks. The governance improvements have established Meridian as a model for corporate oversight in family-influenced technology companies, Patricia reported to the assembled board members and institutional investors. The procedures ensure that strategic decisions are based on business merit rather than personal relationships, while maintaining operational flexibility for competitive response. The legal analysis emphasized both crisis resolution and systemic improvement, acknowledging that Brad Morrison's appointment had inadvertently provided opportunity to address governance vulnerabilities that might otherwise have remained unrecognized until more serious problems emerged. The board's decisive response had demonstrated institutional investor confidence, while establishing precedents for future management evaluation. Richard Morrison used the annual meeting to formally acknowledge the strategic errors that had created the crisis, personal accountability that reinforced the governance culture the reforms were designed to establish. The appointment of unqualified family members to senior positions represents a fundamental failure of business judgment that compromised both operational performance and shareholder value, he stated with obvious conviction. The public acknowledgement was professionally significant and personally courageous, demonstrating the kind of leadership accountability that institutional investors required for sustained confidence in corporate governance. Richard's willingness to accept responsibility for strategic miscalculations reinforced the culture of performance-based evaluation that the governance reforms were designed to institutionalize. Brad Morrison's subsequent career provided an interesting epilogue to his brief and unsuccessful tenure at Meridian Technologies. The management consulting position his uncle had helped him secure in New York proved better suited to his analytical capabilities and business school training, client advisory work that utilized strategic frameworks without requiring operational implementation responsibility. According to industry contacts, Brad had apparently learned valuable lessons about the difference between theoretical management knowledge and practical leadership competence, though his LinkedIn profile continued to emphasize strategic vision and operational optimization as core professional capabilities. The experience had been educational for him in ways that business school case studies typically didn't address. I heard he's been telling people that technology companies require different management approaches than he initially understood, Marcus reported with obvious amusement during one of our regular administrative meetings. Apparently he's developed some insights about domain expertise and technical leadership requirements. The second-hand reports suggested that Brad had gained practical understanding of why corporate governance procedures existed and why qualified leadership was essential for operational effectiveness, though whether this translated to improved strategic judgment remained unclear. His brief tenure at Meridian had provided comprehensive education in corporate power dynamics and management accountability. Elena Rodriguez received recognition from the National Institute of Standards and Technology for her quantum encryption innovations, federal acknowledgement that positioned Meridian's technical achievements within the broader context of national cybersecurity capabilities. The award ceremony in Washington provided opportunity to discuss the relationship between technical excellence and corporate governance, themes that had become central to our company's strategic identity. The quantum encryption success wouldn't have been possible under management that viewed technical innovation as operational inefficiency requiring optimization, Elena observed during her acceptance speech. Comments that were later referenced in business school case studies about technology leadership and strategic decision-making. The recognition reinforced Meridian's position as an industry leader, while validating the governance approach that prioritized technical competence over theoretical management frameworks. Elena's achievements demonstrated the value of qualified leadership that understood both scientific principles and commercial applications. The case study implications of Brad Morrison's failed appointment extended beyond Meridian to influence broader discussions about family business governance and management evaluation criteria in technology companies. Harvard Business School requested permission to develop curriculum materials based on the crisis and resolution academic analysis that would help future MBA students understand the practical limitations of theoretical strategic frameworks. Patricia Hartwell coordinated the academic collaboration while ensuring that confidential business information remained protected. Legal oversight that allowed educational analysis without compromising competitive positioning. The case study development provided opportunity to document governance best practices while contributing to management education that emphasized practical competence over theoretical knowledge. The case illustrates why corporate governance procedures exist and why institutional investors evaluate management teams based on demonstrated capabilities rather than academic credentials, Patricia explained to the Harvard research team. Theoretical strategic frameworks require practical experience and domain expertise to produce effective leadership decisions. The academic analysis emphasized both crisis resolution and systemic reform, acknowledging that governance failures often provided opportunities to implement improvements that strengthened, rather than weakened, corporate oversight procedures. The case study would help future business students understand the relationship between strategic thinking and operational competence. By the second anniversary of Brad Morrison's appointment and termination, Meridian Technologies had achieved market capitalization that exceeded $500 million, valuation growth that reflected both technical innovation and governance excellence. The quantum encryption platform had become an industry standard, generating licensing revenue that supported continued research and development, while establishing competitive moats that protected market positioning. The success story attracted attention from acquisition-interested technology conglomerates, strategic buyers who recognized both technical capabilities and governance quality as valuable assets worthy of premium valuations. These discussions provided opportunity to evaluate strategic options while maintaining focus on innovation and operational excellence. The governance reforms have become as valuable as the technical innovations, Margaret Thornton observed during acquisition strategy discussions. Potential buyers understand that qualified leadership and accountability procedures are essential for protecting the intellectual property and innovation culture that drive competitive advantage. The venture capital perspective emphasized governance as strategic asset rather than administrative requirement, recognizing that management competence and oversight procedures directly influenced corporate valuation and acquisition attractiveness. The reforms implemented following Brad Morrison's failure had strengthened rather than constrained strategic positioning. Richard Morrison announced his intention to gradually transition CEO responsibilities to allow focus on strategic advisory roles that utilized his entrepreneurial experience while ensuring continuity of qualified leadership. The succession planning process incorporated governance procedures that required board evaluation of management candidates based on demonstrated competence rather than personal relationships. The transition provides opportunity to institutionalize the leadership culture that has made Meridian successful, he explained during succession planning discussions. Future CEOs will be selected based on their ability to maintain technical excellence and innovation focus rather than their capacity for operational optimization through efficiency metrics. The succession approach emphasized continuity of strategic philosophy, while acknowledging that different leadership styles might enhance rather than compromise competitive positioning. Richard's gradual transition would ensure stability while allowing new leadership to build on established foundations of technical excellence and governance accountability. Looking back on the crisis that Brad Morrison's appointment had created, the experience provided comprehensive education in corporate governance, management evaluation, and strategic decision-making that benefited everyone involved. His spectacular miscalculation had inadvertently strengthened Meridian's competitive position while establishing governance procedures that would prevent similar problems in the future. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, that someone who had attempted to demonstrate strategic leadership by eliminating perceived operational inefficiencies had actually created the circumstances that led to implementing governance improvements that enhanced both operational effectiveness and shareholder value. Brad's failure had been educational for the entire organization in ways that theoretical business frameworks typically couldn't achieve. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from witnessing comprehensive failures of strategic overconfidence, Elena observed during our final project review meeting. Business school case studies usually don't include the part where the MBA discovers he's been fired by the person he terminated for operational redundancy. The educational value extended beyond Meridian to influence broader understanding of why technology companies required leadership that combined business acumen with technical expertise, domain knowledge that couldn't be substituted through generalized management frameworks, regardless of their theoretical sophistication. The case had become a cautionary tale about the limitations of academic credentials when confronted with operational complexity. The quantum encryption platform continued generating innovation opportunities that required exactly the kind of technical leadership that Brad Morrison had dismissed as implementation detail, requiring optimization through improved efficiency metrics. Each advancement confirmed that competitive advantage in technology markets demanded ongoing commitment to technical excellence rather than cost reduction initiatives that could compromise innovation capabilities. As I reflected on the experience from my restored corner office, watching Elena's team prepare presentations for the next generation of quantum security innovations, the lesson seemed clear. Corporate governance procedures existed for good reasons. Institutional investor confidence required qualified leadership, and strategic thinking without practical competence often produced exactly the opposite of intended outcomes. Brad Morrison had provided Meridian Technologies with an expensive but comprehensive education in why business school theory required domain expertise and practical experience to produce effective management decisions. His brief tenure had been unsuccessful but ultimately valuable, creating the circumstances that led to governance improvements and operational excellence that strengthened competitive positioning in ways that purely theoretical strategic optimization never could have achieved. The story had ended exactly as corporate governance procedures were designed to ensure, with qualified leadership restored, institutional investor confidence maintained, and operational performance protected against management decisions that threatened rather than enhanced competitive advantage. Sometimes the most educational lessons came from allowing people to fully demonstrate their misunderstanding of complex business environments, particularly when governance procedures existed to limit the damage such education might cause. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.